Okay, so full disclosure, I love Star Trek. I don't like describing myself as a fan of big corporately owned multimedia franchises because I don't think it's healthy to tie my identity to something that's managed by a giant soulless blob of exploitative enterprises, no pun intended. But if I'm being honest, when it comes to Star Trek, fan is probably the right word for it. I adore the series' utopian vision of a moneyless, post-capitalist, post-colonialist, post-nationalist, and post-racist future Earth that's part of a united federation of planets whose citizens trek through the galaxy in search of other species and worlds, putting themselves in danger not because capital forces them into it to survive, but because they're genuinely driven by their curiosity and an urge to peacefully explore. It's fallen short of that vision, sometimes spectacularly throughout the decades that Star Trek shows have been in the air, but it's that hopeful current running throughout the franchise that's always made me excited to watch the next episode. Which makes it all the more tragic how awfully the series has depicted sexual violence from the 60s all the way to the early 2000s. Despite having an unusually high amount of female writers, especially for the time, the original Star Trek featured multiple on-screen instances of sexual violence, which are either framed as sexy when Kirk does it, or at best not treated with the gravitas they deserve. You would expect consent to be a bit murky in a show from the 60s, but you would expect a bit more from a show about a supposedly gender-blind future than to have something like this be done, and then just kind of laugh it off as a funny social mishap. Counselor Troy is the victim of severe sexual violence by way of telepathy multiple times throughout the run of The Next Generation, throughout the 80s and 90s, and the subsequent movies, and it's never treated with the gravitas that it deserves. The traumatic effect any of this has on Troy is never centered and never remarked upon in future episodes. In Nemesis, Picard even asked her to telepathically open herself up to her abuser so that they can locate him, which... giant yikes. Star Trek Voyager doesn't portray anything this explicit or graphic, but messaging-wise, I think it's safe to say that the Season 4 episode Retrospect is by far the worst Star Trek episode about sexual assault that has ever aired before, or luckily since. Arguably, put a pin in that. Let's start with a recap of this trash fire of an episode. This story focuses on 7 of 9, a former member of the Borg Collective, basically a hive mind of cyborg beings that assimilate members of other species into themselves, who is now serving on the Federation starship Voyager. When she has a weirdly violent and emotional reaction to a shady profiteering arms dealer named Kovin, she and the ship's doctor try to figure out why that is, and they uncover a blocked memory of 7 of 9 forcibly having Borg nanoprobes extracted from her blood so that Kovin can profit off them by turning them into weapons or whatever, and Kovin then blocking the memory from 7's mind. This is, of course, not literally an instance of sexual assault, but it's made very clear by the framing of the episode that you're meant to view it that way. 7 even says, "I was violated," and we also have the word of the author to back up that that was the intent. Kovin is then confronted with these accusations by Captain Janeway, and when he refuses to cooperate with an investigation conducted by the Voyager crew, they call in the help of the local authorities. Kovin is devastated by this, by the way, because he thinks the accusation alone will ruin his life because his reputation will be ruined. His reputation as a morally upstanding war profiteer. Okay. Initially, the investigation seems to corroborate 7's story. It actually doesn't really, but Kovin seems to think it does for some reason. He's afraid that he will be convicted, in part because the Voyager crew mostly rallies around 7, except for Tuvok, but Tuvok was literally a cop and you can't expect a cop to take sexual assault allegations seriously. Kovin flees in his ship to escape justice and Voyager pursues. Then the episode takes the wildest of turns when it turns out that Kovin did not in fact do any of the things that 7 accused him of. You see, due to a phaser accident, 7's memories got scrambled, and what she remembered was actually just an amalgamation of Borg assimilation memories that she had projected onto Kovin. Oops. The crew makes contact with Kovin to tell him that they found evidence of his innocence, but he doesn't believe them, and tries to fire at Voyager, which causes a weapons overload that makes his own ship explode, killing him. The final moments of the episode are of the crew lamenting how they shouldn't have just believed 7 because she's their friend, and 7 of 9 having her first experience of remorse for the mistake? The mistake of making an accusation that she had every reason to believe was true, a conviction that was strengthened by the ship's doctor. Okay. It's clear what's happening here, right? This episode reads as a preemptive counter-argument against what would later become one of the credos of the Me Too movement. Believe women. Or more broadly, believe victims, just so the MRAs don't have an urge to comment about how men get sexually abused too. Yes, they do. No, it's not even comparable in scale to the amount of times it happens to women, so it only makes sense to also focus on societal attitudes towards women in discussions about sexual assault. And also, you're not doing anything for male sexual assault survivors by trying to tear down the Me Too movement. If anything, you're hurting them. Tangent over. This is an episode about false accusations. and people's willingness to believe those accusations, completely ruining a man's life. It doesn't just imply that accusers can't be trusted to tell the truth, but also that they can't even be trusted to accurately remember what happened to them. Anyone with even a minimal amount of basic media literacy can see that that's what this episode is about, but just in case you're about to comment about how I'm reading too much into things, here's a quote from the staff writer Brian Fuller about this episode. "We hear so much about how false memories can essentially ruin people's lives, how well-respected and credited doctors have been completely dethroned, how teachers and parents have been humiliated. The idea that false sexual assault allegations are at all common is based on very little evidence. The highest estimate of false allegations that based on anything lies at around 5%, and even that number is actually hugely inflated. This statistic is based solely on accusations that were made to the police by college students, even though college sexual assaults are not reported to the police in an estimated 95% of cases. For the general population, the number of unreported sexual assaults lies at around 90%. So that is 5% of only 5 to 10%. So, closer to 0.5% overall. And that number is still too high because the definition of a false accusation is way too broad and determined at the discretion of the police. An accusation that's recanted is automatically logged as false, for instance, even though there's a myriad of reasons one might recant an accusation, such as fear of reprisal by the accused, not wanting to be forced to relive their trauma in court, or fear of not being believed, because, I don't know, have you considered we live in a society that has a bit of a hard time believing women? Police have also logged accusations as unfounded for truly insane reasons, like one case in which a victim had previously allowed her alleged rapist to remove the victim's ski boots, which the police somehow found to be incriminating on the part of the accuser. Let's not forget that the police itself has a long and disturbing history of committing sexual violence, so it might not be ideal that they are the ones interpreting these statistics. Whichever way you slice it, false accusations are exceedingly rare, and when you think about it for even a second, that is completely to be expected. Sexual violence is notoriously hard to prove in a court of law because there are usually no witnesses and forensic evidence disappears over time, and victims usually can't bring themselves to file a report within that time because that's just not how people respond after such an immensely traumatic event. If it is this hard to get any kind of justice for victims of sexual assault, not to mention the fact that there's an army of basement dwellers always sitting at the ready to attack and defame anyone who accuses any man of sexual misconduct, what would anyone have to gain by making a false accusation? Another suggestion this episode makes is that false allegations of sexual assault often completely ruin someone's life and reputation, and do they? Let's examine some prominent examples from the time around which this episode was written. In 1991, Anita Hill alleged that Supreme Court nominee Clarence Thomas had sexually harassed her when he was her supervisor at the Department of Education. There were reportedly several witnesses willing to corroborate Hill's accusations at Thomas's confirmation hearing, but they were not called. Allegedly, because of a deal between the Republicans and the chair of the Senate Judiciary Committee, a man named Joseph Robinette Biden. Hill's character was publicly defamed on national TV, and Clarence Thomas still sits on the Supreme Court. This was a huge national story only a few years before this episode aired, so it must have been on the writers' minds when writing this drivel. And even just a few years ago, it was demonstrated that one could still be credibly accused of sexual assault and get on the Supreme Court. Let us also mention the myriad actors and celebrities that have somehow escaped the short-lived reckoning that was the peak of the Me Too movement, and are still gainfully employed in their chosen field. Summer of Morbius, anyone? Aside from a few sacrificial lambs, it would seem that even well-founded and numerous accusations still don't tend to ruin powerful people's reputation, and this episode wasn't written now, but in the Clinton years. So even if we don't take into account the comically convoluted way that this episode's false accusation leads to the literal death of the accuser, the underlying assumption that such accusations would irreparably damage his reputation hold very little water in the real world. Let us, however, for a moment give this episode way too much credit just for the sake of fairness. In the 90s and before, there were cases in which therapists, through unproven psychological techniques and undue suggestion, did uncover certain quote-unquote buried memories, which likely never took place. In a high-profile 1994 case, which would have been shortly before the airing of this episode, a therapist was declared negligent in a court of law after falsely causing a patient to remember sexual assault by her father in childhood. The idea that such cases are at all widespread, however, is demonstrably false, even though the specter of false memory syndrome has haunted sexual assault cases for a long time. Studies have shown time and again that, on average, recovered memories are actually not less reliable than regular memories. The myth of false memory syndrome nevertheless spread quickly, spearheaded by the False Memory Syndrome Foundation, an organization that is now disbanded, and many of the foundation's advisors have long ago been sidelined by the wider scientific community. Also, it was founded by someone who has himself accused of the sexual abuse of his daughter, which might indicate that finding scientific proof might not have been the foremost goal of the foundation. Despite lobbying efforts and research funding, false memory syndrome has never been accepted as a legitimate diagnosis, because the research just points to it not really being a thing. So yeah, even if we give this episode the most credit that we can, we still end up with a story that propagates harmful, disproven ideas about sexual violence. I do want to reiterate that overall, Star Trek has gotten a lot better about this sort of thing. When sexual assault is dealt with again in Season 1 and 2 of Star Trek Discovery, it is a bit mixed, but it is portrayed as what it actually is, a truly harrowing event with long-lasting consequences that we actually get to see being explored. While it's still somewhat used for its shock value in Season 1, a bit of a Brian Fuller original, because yes, the same Brian Fuller from the quote earlier was also co-creator for Season 1 of Discovery, it is a far cry from the one-and-done, mostly consequenceless assaults of the 90s, which barely put any focus on the victim and mostly used sexual violence as an easy way to vilify certain characters, a problem Discovery doesn't have. To the point where it has the opposite problem of over-empathizing with the abuser. Yeah, I genuinely like a lot of Brian Fuller's work, but this appears to be a subject he'd better just stay away from. Overall, I'd say that in general, sexual assault on screen is something you'd best stay away from if you don't have a really specific reason for showing it and actually want to meaningfully explore the issue. And over the last couple of years, Trek luckily has stayed away from it. So I got good hopes that episodes like this will only seem more and more like relics of the past as time goes on. Star Trek, after all, is supposed to show as a utopian example, a future we would all like to live in. This is going to be a bit of a weird transition given the subject matter, but I really do have to beg for likes, comments, subscriptions, etc. at the end, because YouTube's algorithm is brutal about engagement and determines my videos' chances of being seen, which are probably already quite low given how it tends to treat videos about sensitive subject matter like this one. Any kind of engagement, therefore, is hugely appreciated. Thank you in advance.